Being strong is not a character trait. Most of the time it is a necessity learned very early, and what begins as necessity is eventually mistaken for the self. This is the thing I want to examine carefully today. Because the exhaustion I am describing is not the exhaustion of doing too much, though these people do too much. It is not the exhaustion of poor sleep or physical strain, though those things are present as well. It is something that sits underneath all of those things. A tiredness that has been accumulating for so long, and so quietly, that the person carrying it has largely stopped noticing it. They have adapted around it the way the body adapts around an old injury. Compensating, adjusting, continuing. The people who came to me carrying this exhaustion were among the most difficult to reach in my clinical years. Not because they were closed, but because they were competent. They could discuss their situation with clarity. They could identify the pressures they were under. They could even, in many cases, articulate the psychological dynamics at work in their lives with considerable accuracy. What they could not do, at least not easily, was allow themselves to be helped. Receiving help was a language they had never been taught to speak, and in some cases it was a language they had been explicitly taught not to want. I want to explain what I mean by that, because it is the heart of what I observed in these patients. Stay with me, because the next part changes the meaning of strength itself. The child who becomes strong does not choose to become strong in any meaningful sense. They become strong because the environment they were in required it. Perhaps there was a parent who could not manage their own distress, and someone had to. Perhaps there was instability in the family that demanded a steady presence, and the child provided it. Perhaps there was illness or absence or chaos of some kind, and the child learned that the way to be safe, to be loved, to be necessary, was to be the one who did not add to the burden, the one who coped, the one who managed, the one who was, in the word I heard again and again from these patients, fine, fine. It is a remarkable word in this context. It means I am not adding to the difficulty. It means you do not need to worry about me. It means I have successfully suppressed whatever is happening inside me to a level where it will not disturb the arrangement. Fine is not a description of a state. It is a performance of containment. And here is what I found, without exception, in every patient of this type. They had been fine for so long that they no longer knew what not fine actually felt like. The original signal had been suppressed so many times that it had become very faint. They could no longer clearly distinguish between genuine equanimity and the habitual performance of it, between actually being well and having learned to behave as though they were. If any part of what I am describing feels immediately familiar, I would be glad if you subscribe to this channel, because what I am about to describe is where this pattern leads over time, and understanding it clearly is the first step towards something different. Let me tell you about a patient I will call Clara. She came to me in her late 60s, referred by her physician, who had found no physical cause for the persistent fatigue she had been reporting. She was, by all external evidence, a person of considerable capability. She had raised children, maintained a household, supported an ailing husband for the last years of his life, and after his death, had continued to be the person her adult children called when they needed help, the person her grandchildren were brought to, the person her neighbors relied on. She had, in the language of those around her, always been so strong. When I asked her when she had last felt genuinely rested, she sat for a long moment. Then she said she could not remember. Not recently, not in the past few years, perhaps not in decades. She had been tired for so long that rest had become for her simply the absence of acute demand rather than any genuine restoration. I asked her what she did with her own distress when she felt it. She looked at me with an expression I have seen many times in patients of this type. Not confusion exactly, more a kind of careful consideration, as though she were being asked about a practice so long discontinued that she had to think back to remember what it had involved. Eventually she said that she put it somewhere. She could not locate it exactly. Somewhere it would not interfere. Somewhere it would not interfere. In 40 years of practice, I do not think I heard a more precise description of the mechanism I was trying to understand. The strong person does not eliminate their distress. They relocate it. They find an internal space where it can be stored without disrupting the functioning they are required to maintain. And they maintain this storage with such consistency across so many years that they eventually lose track of how much has accumulated there. But here is what most people miss entirely. What is stored does not diminish. This is the central fact that the strong person is almost never told, because the people around them prefer not to know it either. The arrangement works for everyone. The strong person manages. The people who depend on them are not burdened. The social system remains functional. Nobody has to confront the cost. But inside the person who has been strong for too long, the accumulated weight is real. It does not dissolve with time. It grows heavier, and it finds expression in ways that are often difficult to trace back to their source. A persistent tiredness that sleep does not address. A low, unnameable sadness that appears without apparent cause. A growing difficulty in feeling pleasure in things that once provided it. A sense described to me by more patients than I can count, of going through the days at a slight remove from them, present but not quite inside the experience. I want to be precise about this last description, because it came up so frequently and in such consistent language. These patients did not describe feeling depressed in the dramatic sense. They described something quieter, a muffling, a distance between themselves and the texture of their own lives, as though a film had been placed between them and direct experience. They could function. They were functioning, but something that should have been immediate felt slightly out of reach. In my private notes, I wrote about what I came to call the cost of sustained containment. Every act of suppression requires energy. Every time a person chooses to relocate their distress rather than express it, something is spent. Over years, over decades, the cumulative expenditure of this containment produces a kind of depletion that operates below the level of conscious awareness. The person does not feel it as a single weight. They feel it as an accumulating difficulty, as a gradual loss of the resilience that used to restore them more easily. Clara told me at one point that she used to recover from difficult periods within days. Lately it took weeks, and some things she was not sure she had recovered from at all. She said this matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, and then she caught herself and added, "But I am managing," as though the managing were itself the evidence that nothing serious was wrong. Stay with me, because the next part is the one these patients resist most. When I began to work with Clara on what the accumulated distress actually contained, she found it almost unbearable. Not because the individual contents were catastrophic, but because acknowledging them required something that felt to her like a fundamental betrayal of the identity she had maintained for 60 years. The strong person, when they first begin to allow themselves to not be strong, does not experience this as relief. They experience it as collapse, as failure, as becoming the very thing they spent their lives refusing to become. I had to work carefully and slowly to distinguish for Clara between the two things she was conflating. There is a genuine strength that comes from having developed real capacities over a lifetime. The ability to manage difficulty, to maintain composure, to continue when things are hard. These are not performances, they are real, and they do not require defending by refusing to acknowledge that you are tired. What Clara was defending was not her genuine strength. She was defending the necessity of it, the old conviction laid down in early life that she was not permitted to need, to ask, to be less than adequate. That permission had never been granted, and in its absence, she had built a life organized around never requiring it. The work then was not to make her stop being strong. It was to offer her the permission she had never received, to give her a space in which her genuine distress could be acknowledged without the world ending, without the people who depended on her dissolving, without her identity collapsing. I want to offer you something practical here. It is small. But for people like Clara, small is the right scale to begin with. Once each day, when the demands have briefly quieted, ask yourself one question. What is it that I am carrying right now that I have not acknowledged to anyone, including myself? You do not need to resolve it or act on it. Simply acknowledge that it exists. Give it the few seconds of honest recognition that it has been asking for. Clara practiced this for several months before she told me what she found there. She said that the first time she asked the question honestly, she was surprised by the volume of what arrived. She had not realized how much had been waiting to be noticed, and merely allowing it to be real for a moment each day had begun, slowly, to make the carrying lighter. Not because the weight had been removed, but because weight that is acknowledged is carried differently from weight that is pretended not to exist. I saw this pattern across every patient of this type who did this work honestly. The exhaustion did not disappear, but it changed character. It became a genuine tiredness which the body and the mind know how to respond to, rather than the peculiar exhaustion of sustained suppression. Before I close, I want to say something directly to anyone who recognizes themselves in what I have described today. The strength you developed was real. What you managed across all those years was genuinely difficult. The people who leaned on you were genuinely helped by your presence. None of that is in question. But there is a difference between the strength you developed and the prohibition on need that came alongside it. The strength belongs to you. The prohibition was never yours to carry. It was a condition of your early environment, not a permanent feature of who you are. You are allowed to be tired, not as a concession, not as a sign that you have finally failed, but as an honest acknowledgement of what it has cost to be what you have been for so long. That acknowledgement is not weakness. It is, in my understanding, the beginning of a kind of honesty with yourself that genuine strength actually requires. What is the thing you have been carrying longest without telling anyone? Leave that in the comments if you are willing. You do not need to explain it. Simply naming it here, in this space, is itself a form of acknowledgement. There is a thread that runs from this conversation into the question of what happens when the strong person finally allows themselves to be cared for, and what that experience tends to produce. That is worth continuing another time. I want to return to something I mentioned in passing and give it more space. The people around the strong person are not, in most cases, indifferent to their well-being. Many of them genuinely love these people, but they have been organized, often for many years, around the premise that this person does not need that they are the steady one, the one who manages. This becomes, over time, a mutual agreement, nobody consciously made, but everybody maintains. When the strong person begins to show that they are tired, this agreement is threatened. The response from those who have depended on it is not always what the strong person hopes for. Sometimes it is genuine care, but sometimes it is a subtle pressure to return to the familiar arrangement. The message, delivered without words, is we need you to be the person we have always needed you to be. I watched Clara navigate this with her adult children. When she began, carefully and with considerable courage, to tell them she was tired, that she needed help, that she could no longer be as available as she had been, the responses were varied. One child adapted with warmth, another quietly withdrew, a third asked with apparent concern whether she was all right. But what Clara heard underneath was the hope she would say yes and resume the previous arrangement. This is not cruelty. It is the ordinary human difficulty of losing an arrangement that has been comfortable. The people in her life had organized around what was available to them. When that changed, they had to adjust, What Clara had to learn is that the adjustment required of the people around her was not her responsibility to manage. She had spent a lifetime managing other people. The task now was to allow them to manage their own, not with coldness, but with the steady refusal to resume the old arrangement, simply because resuming it would have made everyone more comfortable. She told me, about a year into our work, that this was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than any of the actual difficulties she had managed across her life, because all of those had involved doing. This required her to stop doing, to hold her ground through presence rather than action, to allow the discomfort of others to exist without immediately moving to resolve it. She said it felt like learning to stand still in a current she had always managed by swimming, and what she discovered gradually was that she did not drown. That stillness, which had always felt like danger, turned out to have a different quality when she finally allowed herself to try it. That is the last thing I want to leave you with today. The exhaustion of the person who has been strong for too long is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something very long has finally reached its limit. And limits, when honestly acknowledged, rather than suppressed further, have a way of becoming the beginning of something more sustainable than what came before.